The first round of the college football playoffs came and it went. And it'd be a lie if I said, oh, these are a nice competitive slate of games. They really weren't. Only the Texas-Clemson game really captured that magic, was close late. The other three are flat out blowouts. I'd like to specifically address these games individually. We will do that towards the second half of this video. But of course, you know we have got to talk about the controversy. We've got to talk about the complaining, and we've got to talk about our friends over there at the SEC. There were a lot of complaints about these games, about who was left out, saying, oh, we don't value competitive games, we value resumes, we value schedules, we value records more than the actual product, which I really don't think is the case. That you cannot make a strong argument a team like Ole Miss, Alabama, or South Carolina could have gone in and played Notre Dame at South Bend and not gotten absolutely shelled. You cannot make an argument that any team, let alone a 3-loss Alabama or Ole Miss team, could have gone and played Ohio State the way they were flying around and not got absolutely shelled. And Penn State, maybe you can make an argument there because really that was Kevin Jennings malfunctioning and throwing 3 interceptions in the first quarter. A SEC team could play better, but I still don't think that's the case. What we learned is that home field advantage is a lot more important than the record, is always going to favor the top seeds who get to host these games. Certain teams do not travel well to cold weather, and if you played in the first round, odds are you are encouraged about how your team looked.
I don't know what college football fans want or expect to happen. Blowouts are a part of sports at every level of competition. Football, baseball, basketball, it happens, and it also is going to happen when you expand the playoffs. Just because you get blown out doesn't mean you didn't deserve to be there or shouldn't have been there in the first place. I mean, you take a look back to the 2014 Super Bowl when you have the Broncos, best offense in regular season history, get blown out by the Seahawks. The 2019 National Championship game in college football, you have Alabama getting blown out by Clemson. No one in their right mind would say Alabama didn't deserve to be there after an undefeated season just because they got blown out by Clemson. Blowouts happen to the best of teams. Sometimes it is just not their day. Now, when it comes to these teams being lesser teams or the right teams were not there, lower ranked teams are always going to lose. You mentioned home field advantage being a significant advantage, and that was going to be the case whether it was Alabama, Ole Miss, LSU, hell, even if you have Syracuse as one of the 3-loss teams we want to mention. You can mention any 3-loss team. It was going to be hard for them to go into these environments and win football games in order for them to win in the next round. And if they made it to the second round, it would have been just as difficult for them to win another game. Historically, across all sports, we see teams struggle that are lower seeds to win playoff games and go on significant runs. For the people that are making the argument that, oh, this shows that we need to reduce the number of playoff teams, there's not enough quality teams, we are always going to have teams that are on the tail end not really stack up with the high-ended teams that make it to the playoffs. In the NFL, there's 14 playoff teams. Only 7 teams have ever made it to the Super Bowl that were a wildcard team and actually won the Super Bowl. If you have a reduced playoff there, we never get the 2000 Giants miraculous run. We never have Aaron Rodgers' 2010 Super Bowl. We don't have Tom Brady's last Super Bowl. In college basketball, when it comes to the top end of the sport dominating, last 2 championships have been won by UConn, number 1 seed, number 4 seed respectively. The 6 years prior to that, a number 1 seed won the national championship in college basketball. So expanding the college football playoff was never meant to have an 12 seed, 11 seeded Alabama make a run and win immediately. That's not going to happen a lot. It might happen every once in a blue moon, but I don't get why, oh, all these 3-loss teams deserve to be there when realistically they probably weren't going to compete regardless.
Well, I think you're comparing apples to oranges, and I do think we could discuss changing the format of the playoffs a little bit maybe. I don't think expanding it to 14 teams is going to be that good for the sport. Basketball, you can just make a bunch of 3-pointers and win any game you're in. It's how St. Peter's can somehow make it to the Final Four. If you were hitting your shots, you're hitting your shots. There's not a clear physical talent disparity in that. The NFL, all 32 teams are relatively equal to each other. College football, some teams have it, some teams don't. Some teams have 10 NFL starters on their roster, some teams have 2. It's a clear difference. Now, I'm not saying those 2 NFL starter teams can't beat these 10 star teams. We saw Vanderbilt beat Alabama. We've seen Georgia lose to inferior teams. We saw Ohio State lose to Michigan. Although that may not be a good example because Michigan is going to have 8-9 guys in the NFL, most of which are on their defense. It's just not a guarantee, as you were saying. I think looking at these games, there were 2 I thought an upset could happen. And if Indiana actually showed up offensively, I think they could have beat Notre Dame. Their defense did a pretty good job outside of that 98-yard rushing touchdown and kept them in it longer than they should have. If anything had been produced by Indiana's offense before the fourth quarter, that game would have been competitive. And I really thought Tennessee might have had a shot against Ohio State, given how bad morale was at the Buckeye Stadium. Clearly, that did not happen. The vibes were a bit more immaculate than anticipated, but no one is projecting SMU to go out there and beat Penn State at Happy Valley. No one was seriously picking Clemson, who wouldn't have even got into the playoffs without winning the ACC championship game, to go beat Texas, a team which has spent $25 million on their roster. It is the way it is. Now, will that eventually happen? Will a 12 seed who sneaks in because they won their conference eventually beat these higher seeds? I feel fairly confident it will. This year just didn't happen to be the year for that. You cannot axe it, though, after 1 year. You just can't do that.
I would agree. I think it's going to happen eventually. And the point I was making by making the comparison to college basketball, to the NFL, to other sports, is that these low-ranked teams, they don't make significant runs all that often. In the NFL last year, one wildcard team won a playoff game. The year before that, two wildcard teams won a playoff team. Both immediately then lost in the next round. At the top end of each respective sport, you're going to have the number one, number two, number three teams be the ones that go on runs. It doesn't happen a lot where you have, let's just say in college football, the 9th seed go on a run and win the national championship game. That is not going to happen often. Will it maybe happen eventually, given the nature of there being so many college football teams? They have 2 losses that are bad early in the year. They get a star player healthy late in the year. I think that can definitely happen, and that is the benefit of this expanded system. But it's not going to happen all of the time, and most of the time, it's going to be the top 4 teams every single year that are still the ones competing for the national championship.
I also like to look at Ohio State specifically. They blew the doors off Tennessee, an SEC team, coincidentally. They very easily could have wound up as the lower seed to Tennessee and then had to go play Tennessee at Knoxville. I still think they would have blown the doors off. They just looked like the better team in all aspects of the game. But if we didn't have this 12-team expanded playoffs, that matchup never happened. So what, do you want to cut it off at 9, 10? Eventually, a lower seed is going. A lower seed could have won if the committee had been a bit more unkind to Ohio State about that Michigan loss. Looking at this next round of games, people are also really hating on the 12-team format. Texas, Arizona State should be fairly competitive. Ohio State, Oregon's going to be great. Penn State, Boise State is a complete crapshoot. No one knows how that's going to go. And Notre Dame, Georgia should be really good. Probably going to be low scoring given Georgia's quarterback injury. But those are 3 quality games we were going to see in the round of 8, which just wouldn't happen if we were still in the 4-team playoff era.
I do think that the way this playoff has been constructed is a little silly. I like the idea that conference champions get an automatic bid to the playoff. I don't necessarily like the idea that conference champions get an automatic bye when it comes to Boise State or ASU. I think it would have made a whole lot more sense if you have these teams get the automatic bid and they just slot in where the College Football Playoff Committee have them ranked, or you have them bump up to the 12 seed like Clemson would be.
I disagree on some of that. I mean, if you want to not have them get a bye, fine, but if you win your conference and get that auto bid, you should get a home game, which would be somewhere in between, like, hey, you're still rewarding the conference champion, but you're not passing Arizona State and Boise State straight to the second round just because they won a slightly weaker conference for Boise State, a much weaker conference in the Mountain West for Arizona State than Boise State. Whatever. You get what I'm saying, though.
Well, then you can also add a caveat to that they get the automatic bid, and if they're the lower seed, they still get the home game. But I mean, it would lead to matchups that make more sense, because that means we would have had the winner of Indiana, Boise State playing Oregon, the winner of Notre Dame, Clemson playing Penn State, the winner of Ohio State versus Arizona State playing Texas, and the winner of Tennessee, SMU playing Georgia. That would have made a lot more sense on the first round of things versus what we got this year.
I mean, I think it's still up in the air. I would like to see how the second round goes before I pass serious judgment. If Arizona State and Boise State, if one of those two pulls off an upset, I am not going to complain about this current formatting at all, because that would be huge for college football. For the final small minority, people are saying, oh, this new format stinks because it completely devalues bowls. Bowls are never going to be valuable again. It's got nothing to do with the 12-team playoff, the 14-team playoff, the national championship. It's got everything to do with NIL and the transfer portal. You're going to have guys opting out even if they might stay at the school so they can test the portal, or opt out, say, hey, this is what the team looks like without me playing on, maybe slide me another NIL check. Even if the playoff format didn't exist, bowls have forever and irreparably been destroyed due to the changes to college football, and people are just going to have to get over that.
I don't get why people are still holding on to that, because it's really...
No, I get why they're holding on to it. The bowls were a rich tradition. I went to the Sugar Bowl when I was younger before the playoffs. It's a great thing, but unfortunately, college football's changed, and those have just kind of lost their value.
There's being more value placed upon the playoff, crowning a champion via more teams competing, and with the transfer portal and players getting paid and talent spreading out across college football, I think overall the changes have been very good for a large majority of teams.
Definitely not for a majority of teams. It's been very good for the teams who can qualify and make it. I mean, maybe you say a majority because everyone's season doesn't instantly get killed if they pick up a bad loss here or there. But I don't know. I do kind of miss the old bowl format. Those were enjoyable football games if everyone was actually really going at it. But I just think college football's changed too much, and you were never going to recapture that magic with the NIL, even if we just go back to the two-team championship game. Looking at the actual games, as I promised we would, Penn State absolutely dismantled SMU. We'll start there. I think SMU competed in this one fairly well outside of their quarterback for the first half. Those 2 pick sixes from Kevin Jennings and that third interception on the screen pass, that just destroyed them. Their defense was playing well. Their offensive line wasn't playing that poorly. Their running game was kind of picking up some yards, but spotting your opponent 3 possessions and 2 touchdowns. You just cannot win a football game that way. Penn State eventually woke up. Their front seven started generating pressure at a high clip. Drew Aller got into the game more. Their running game really got going with those 2 big, bruising, powerful running backs who could both wind up as starters in the NFL, and they just ran over the Mustangs. Not that shocking of an outcome. I think you are very encouraged about this game if you are Penn State going up against a team you are definitely more talented than in the second round on a neutral site. Maybe you'd like a little bit more rest. Maybe you're a bit naggled and hurt due to injuries, but very encouraging win for Penn State. I think they are going to get to the round of 4.
Penn State winning the first playoff game was not a shock to anyone. They are extremely close to winning their conference championship, and they played Ohio State very close during the year, which were their only 2 losses. So beating up on an SMU team that didn't even win their respective conference championship, it wasn't a surprise. And you mentioned the talent they have at running back, what Drew Aller making some plays here and there, knowing how good their front seven was. It was an expected performance regardless of who they played in the first round at least.
Yeah, it's also going to Happy Valley in the cold, not to keep harping back. Do you really think Ole Miss, who went to Florida and lost that game, is going to be able to stand up to that environment with 20-degree weather? Come on now. It was worse than it could have been. SMU did come out strong outside of Kevin Jennings. I don't want to harp too much on him, but he was undoubtedly why SMU didn't compete in that game. Sad but true. Notre Dame, Indiana, the closest final score, not the closest game. Indiana's defense also came into play. Their D-line outside that 98-yard touchdown played very well the first half, eventually just got worn down because their offense could get absolutely nothing going. A certain coach of the year talked a very big game and played incredibly conservatively. Decided, hey, I would rather not get blown out entirely instead of potentially win this game. Disappointing from him. I think Indiana conceivably could be back, but their path to the playoffs was relatively easy. I think they're going to have to play 2 pretty competitive Big Ten schools in future years. It's not their fault. They had Washington and Michigan on their schedule. Michigan fell apart. Washington lost their entire team to the NFL, basically, or to the SEC. Neither here nor there. They belong. They were a 1-loss Power 4 team, but very encouraging from Indiana. Their passing attack still leaves a lot to be desired, in my opinion, but how they ran against that Indiana front seven, that vaunted run defense, bodes well for their matchup against Georgia. If they can get something going on the ground next round like they did this round, they could definitely beat the best team in the SEC and arguably the best team in the country.
Yeah, never in recent memory have heading into the college football playoff, if there was an expanded playoff in years past, or looking at just the 4-team playoff, would you look at a team like Notre Dame, who I think would have been the 5 seed?
They would have been the 4 seed, I really do think. And I think the committee...
They were seeded as a 5 seed,
They were seeded as the 5 seed, but I think if the committee had to choose between them and a 4-loss Penn State team, or a 2-loss Penn State team to make that final playoff spot, they would have chosen Notre Dame.
Regardless, they were one of the teams on the bubble in a 4 playoff team scenario. You're never going to pick that team to lose against a 2-loss Indiana team who's ranked 9th?
10th, actually.
They were not ranked overly high, and they were playing a team that, if in a 14 playoff, was right on the bubble. This was never going to be a close game. In years past, no one ever would have thought this was going to be a close game, and the only reason people were staring at the outcome, oh, is it going to be a blowout, is because you had a lot of fans salty. Their favorite 3-loss team did not make it in. So the result is not shocking. The product we got on the field is not shocking. And I think, as we mentioned earlier in this podcast, home field advantage plays a significant role in college football when you have college students traveling that far to play a football game.
Bouncing on over to the Texas-Clemson game, this one was a very competitive matchup late. Obviously, Texas had that massive second quarter, but Clemson started the game. Nice long touchdown drive. If you're a Clemson fan, you have got to be encouraged from what you were seeing from Cade Klubnik and TJ Moore, true freshman wide receiver, who was among the best in college football. That is undoubtedly going to be a potent pairing in years to come. Klubnik passed his way back into this game against a vaunted Texas defense, which had held a really strong Georgia offense, if they were actually clicking, to very few points in the SEC championship game. I think the future is very bright, particularly with Dabo getting in the portal, getting that edge player out of Purdue, the #1 edge in the country. I think Clemson will be back in the 12-team playoff. They will win the ACC again unless Belichick really cooks up some devil magic. Looking at Texas, you would like your defense to perform a little bit better, but you were in pass coverage a lot of that game. The raw number is a bit understandable. Quinn Ewers is still worrying to me. He's not moving that well. They had him on a lot of painkillers. He clearly could not reach his top speed. He was not stuffing the stat sheet. And they're relying on a running game, which had not been that present earlier in the year, to carry them to this win. I don't think that run game quite manifests the same way. Maybe in the next round against Arizona State they can get going, but once they play in Oregon and Ohio State and Georgia again, I don't think that run game is going to be as potent. I think they're going to get knocked off again. It's hard to say what Arizona State is going to look like, but them winning this game due to the strength of their rushing attack is not repeatable for Texas, in my opinion.
Yeah, with hindsight being 20/20 vision and taking a look at the games that took place this past weekend, it makes a lot of sense why this game was the most competitive game. Because you have a Texans team where their offense has, especially their passing attack, has kind of been waning in lieu of Quinn Ewers basically becoming completely immobile with the injuries that he's been dealing with. He hasn't been passing the ball at a high level. They were able to dominate things on the ground. And then you have a Clemson team that has had a couple bad games, but they still have a lot of talent on their roster. Cade Klubnik was a 5-star quarterback when he was coming out as a recruit from high school, so he is a very talented player. You mentioned the talented receivers that they have, so it makes sense that this Clemson team against a Texas team that in some areas of the game have been struggling a little bit were able to keep and make this game close. I don't think 20/20 hindsight vision, it is that much of a shock this game was closer than some would have expected.
And Texas also has arguably the best offensive line in the country. They were getting away with a lot of holding. It's not some criticism saying, oh, Texas should have won. Clemson's O-line was getting away with holding too. They were just a little bit physically overmatched against that high-end talent in the Texas front seven. If they get to play football like that in their remaining games, it's also going to work to their favor. And I also want to briefly touch on Jaden Blue before we move on. Obviously, had that long 77-yard touchdown, but even if you remove that, he was incredibly effective. Limited early in the year due to an injury. If Texas is going to be able to sustain their rushing attack, it is going to be on the back of Jaden Blue. All due respect to Q Wiz, but he's just not quite that guy. It's going to have to be a blue Christmas and a blue New Year's if they want to compete for that national championship. Finally, Tennessee visiting Ohio State. And I'm a Michigan fan. I have no joy about Ohio State winning this game. But you said you weren't going to say it on air. I am going to say it. This was a good thing for college football. Tennessee got blown out the way they did. The final score does not do it justice. This was the most lopsided game of the day. And it makes no sense at a glance it was this bad. Tennessee's defensive line is maybe not comparably talented to Michigan's, because Michigan's got 3 first-round picks, but they've got some real names. They should have been able to get pressure on Ohio State. They couldn't. They should have been able to watch how Michigan covered Ohio State's superstar receiver, said, okay, we're going to bracket their best one and have our guys try and step up and make plays in one-on-one in cold weather against their 2 and 3. They didn't do that. They had man coverage against Jeremiah Smith all game. We saw how that went. He tortured their secondary. Ohio State's defensive line played phenomenal. Consistently got pressure on Nico Amaliava. Once he got off his first read, he really couldn't do anything. The run game for Tennessee even though they had somewhat more of a passing attack backing them up than Michigan did. Pathetic. And it's not a good look for the SEC. It's not a good look for Tennessee. It makes me question Ian Malia's ability to progress into that first-round talent, into a quarterback who can lead his team to the national championship. Obviously, he's a sophomore. He's young. He's got 1, maybe 2 more years in college. This is a bad loss for Tennessee and a great win for Ohio State. If they play like this, they can beat anybody.
Yeah, I think this game showed just how talented the Ohio State roster really is. Tennessee did have the SEC Offensive Player of the Year get injured during the game, so that did not make anything easier. But the Ohio State's defense, it was flying all over the field. It jumped off the screen just how much more talented their defense was than Tennessee's offense. And Ohio State's offense, they're better at basically every position, also comparing the two offenses, having the better wide receivers, the better offensive line, the better 2 running backs when you have Dylan Sampson injured and not playing. The only thing you could say Tennessee's better at, and it's not even really a thing because he missed so many throws, is Nico's the more athletically gifted quarterback between him and Will Howard, but he was throwing the ball over the place. He couldn't hit the broad side of a barn, and that has been his biggest weakness throughout the course of the season and gives you a little bit pause when it comes to his development and being a top prospect in the NFL. So Tennessee was outmatched all over the place. I think they clearly were the 3rd best SEC team heading into this college football playoff, and there's a reason they made it versus the other 3 lost teams. But it is what it is.
I'd argue South Carolina. I've talked a lot of crap about South Carolina. I've not heard many of their fans complaining all that much. I think South Carolina was the 3rd best SEC team, just had a really unlucky loss against LSU due to officiating, which cost them. They might have put up a better fight against OSU, particularly if they didn't lose their star offensive players. Travion Hendrickson had a long 29-yard carry. Before that, was fairly effective on the ground as well. That came as a result of Will Howard and that Ohio State offense getting things going through the air. That has kind of given them the formula, which I'm sure they already knew, that you need something from your passing attack if you want to open things up on the ground with your injured offensive line. Makes life a lot easier. But against Oregon, I don't know. It's going to be a competitive game. Maybe one of the best games of the year for all we know. Hopefully it's not a blowout so we don't have people complaining about how Ohio State and or Oregon shouldn't have been there. But I digress. All in all, a very telling weekend of games. I look forward to the round of 8, and I will let you hit any closing thoughts you've got.
I've basically said everything I need to say. Let us know what you think about the college football playoff down in the comments below. Like the video, subscribe, use code Thicc on Underdog, bonus cash up to $1,000, and we'll see you in the next one.